I'm Katharine White. I'm a developer at Investec. I've been there for a year and a half. Before that, I spent a ridiculous amount of time at university getting some very useless degrees and doing some research that didn't help anyone. So today I'm hoping I'm going to talk about something that will be useful to someone, and that's promises that have been introduced into JavaScript natively since ES6. Many of you probably have come across promises using some other library. Can I just see by show of hands who has worked with promises at some point? Yeah, quite a lot of you. You'll probably find some of this repetitive. It is a slightly different implementation to the other APIs. Just another show of hands, how many of you have actually used ES6's promises? Not too many. Okay, that's a relief. Basically, for those of you who haven't worked with them, they're objects, unlike callbacks, which are functions. They allow for you to really do kind of synchronous style development in JavaScript by like aggregating your callbacks and chaining them, and therefore being able to like sequence properly and bubble out errors properly. Essentially, a promise is an object with a then method that returns another promise that is fulfilled when a fulfilled handler or error handler is completed. As I said, they have been used in other libraries such as Q, RSVP, and obviously each of these APIs implementations is quite different, but they are generally consistent with the common JS promises that was defined a few years ago. I did have it somewhere written down. The big difference between promises and deferreds that some of you might have come across in jQuery, or even the so-called promises in jQuery are actually just deferreds, is that real promises actually return promises themselves, allowing you to chain them properly, which you can't do with a deferred in jQuery. And as I said, this allows for you to have a composition of multiple promises and also bubble out errors more effectively. For those of you who've worked with callbacks and how painful they are, one of the things that I found difficult was when you've got a whole bunch of things that you need to have fetched before you render a screen, like reference lists to populate drop-downs or something like that. You have to keep track of, if you want to call them all asynchronously, keep track of which ones have come back before you can show the page. I've seen horrible implementations like this one, of trying to keep track of how many collections and see if you've got them all back, then we can show the page. Promises make this a lot easier. You just go into basically wrap inside your fetch method all your HTTP calls and stuff inside a promise. Then you just create an array of promises and use, sorry, that says collections.all, that's supposed to say promises.all. This isn't the actual code that I ran, because the code that I had that I was going to demo belongs to Investec, and I'd probably be fired if I showed you. So I kind of put together some examples this morning, so sorry if they're wrong. That's supposed to say promises.all. Using the all keyword just means that only once all of these promises in this array have returned either a success or a failure will you go into the next then callback. So that was the example where you wanted to just get all the asynchronous calls back and know that they were all done. The other example the promises helps with is if you actually want to sequence them and do one call and then another asynchronous call. Previously, you ended up doing like nested, this is a small example so it would fit on the slide, but I've got examples where you have like 15 nested calls in order for them to come back in order. Promises also makes that a lot simpler. Again, just wrapping your actual fetch method into a promise means that you can sequentially call then on your fetch method, because it is itself a promise. And promises are venable, which doesn't feel like a real word, but it's out there. In terms of like error handling with promises, One of the nice things that they've also got is a catch method, which is the same as a then, but just focusing on the error handler, and these can also be chained, so you can alternate your sequence between then and catch to handle any errors that might have come back. This is an example that somebody else did, because I haven't been able to run this the development I've been doing is for iOS and in a hybrid mess, and that iOS isn't yet working with generators aren't yet working in Safari. Promises are, but not yet generators. So this is an example using generators to create an even simpler synchronous style coding environment in JavaScript. Don't need to go too much into this spawn method, but the important thing that I wanted to point out is the yield keyword, which is on the next slide. This one essentially just creates a generator which allows you to break out of a function and return to that function at the same point using the yield keyword, which allows you to do something like this, where you can say you want to fetch something and then just wait until that point. So the yield keyword allows you to essentially just say, I want to call this synchronously and wait before I carry on with the implementation. And again, you can do that inside of loops as well, so that even though you've defined the promises in advance, you can then loop through them sequentially. I think the other important thing I wanted to talk about is compatibility issues. Promises themselves are supported in most browsers now: Chrome, Firefox, Edge. Safari has almost everything that you would need, and all the examples that I've shown would work in Safari. And likewise, most of your mobile devices will now work with promises. At least 90% of the functionality is working in Android and iOS. But generators, and there was a for of example that someone spoke about, are also not working properly yet in Safari, and in iOS. I think they're working in Android. Just some references that might be interested if you want to learn more about these things. Obviously, ECMA and Mozilla will have nice API references, which I find are easier to read than trying to filter through ugly comments on questions. And then, there's some nice tutorials on HTML5 Rocks where I got that last example from. They really take you through in detail how to set up your promises in an example, and get the compatibility in detail. And there's some good blogs out there as well. James Nelson has also documented it quite well. And I know that was very quick. So are there any questions?
Wasn't question so much, if you want to use generators, because they're pretty awesome, you can use Babel to transpile code to work in ES5. They've just got rapid functions. It gives you the same functionality, and Bluebird is a nice library to do your promises if it's not implemented natively. And it will fall back if there's native promises.